Hello. Welcome everybody that's tuning in. My name's Chris Van Tassel, and we're in the gallery, The Story of Virginia at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, right here in Richmond. And we're going to continue our series of guided tours. As I go through here today, we'll be picking up where we left off with the colonial history last time and exploring the history of the American Revolution, especially what happens in Virginia, and then a little bit of what happens after the Revolution. As always, feel free to follow up with more information on our website. You can go to virginiahistory.org. These series of tours will be archived, and so please explore that as well. To begin with today, I wanted to pick up with last time we discussed a court case in Hanover County argued by Patrick Henry called the Parsons Cause. And without going back into that case, Patrick Henry was challenging the authority of King George III, the monarch of Great Britain and thus Virginia. And so this is very early on, before the revolution happens. It shows this idea of an American identity that was separate from British. Not everybody was feeling like Patrick Henry that early on, but we'll see some shifts in attitudes as we go through here. Another thing that we'll pick back up with for a moment is the story of the French and Indian War. This was the conflict between the British colonies and France over the control of that Ohio Valley. And it's a war which Great Britain and thus the American colonies win. And one of the results is that Great Britain went heavily into debt to finance that war. When a government is in debt and needs money, and especially for any of the students out there, you kind of remember that word taxes or taxation. So in 1764, they said they were going to have a tax on sugar. And that meant anybody in the colonies buying sugar has to pay extra money for it. And the government could use that money to finance the cost of this conflict. Well, there was a problem with that in the minds of many colonists, which was that they didn't vote for the people in Parliament, the body that made laws over in England, and therefore they felt like they weren't represented. So you get this rallying cry, this slogan of no taxation without representation. The following year, in 1765, there's a tax on paper called the Stamp Act. And this further angers some colonists who feel like their rights are being ignored by the British government back across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, some people are what we would call loyalists. They remained loyal to the king and thought the taxes were legitimate. The people who did not and wanted more of a national independence were called patriots. And then we'll see some people didn't really take sides, and they're referred to as neutralists, or people that are in the middle, didn't want the war in their backyard, basically. So to talk a little bit more about this with an eye on Virginia, I'm going to show you three graphics here. These three images show three of the most prominent Virginians that are involved in the American Revolution. And one is Patrick Henry. Sometimes he gets the nickname the voice of the revolution because he was a really good speaker. And of course, that's an important thing in a time when all communication was done either verbally or through writing. They didn't have the media of today. So people's words had to be powerful if you wanted to impress an audience. And he's most famous. Every student in Virginia grows up learning 1775, in which some men were saying, it's time for Virginia to raise a militia and fight the British. Some were saying, no, we should wait and see if we can achieve a peace. And Patrick Henry ends his speech with those famous words, give me liberty or give me death, saying, I know not what course others may take, but I'm ready to die or become independent. So that nickname makes sense. Another is Thomas Jefferson's nickname, who's sometimes referred to as the pen of the revolution. Now, students out there probably already know he's most famous for being the primary author of the American Declaration of Independence, and we'll see more about that on the other side. He also grew up in a Virginia where religion and government were not separate. So the Church of England, or what was called the Anglican Church, was part of the government. And he thought that that should be a separate thing from an actual government. So he's also famous for authoring a document called the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedoms. And so these ideas and rights will later get incorporated into a new government after we achieve independence, which can only be done militarily. Great Britain was not willing to let the colonies simply go off on their own and become a new nation. So George Washington becomes what we call the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. When I say continental, we're not talking about all in North America. We're talking about the 13 colonies on the east coast of the continent. These were British North America, from Georgia up to Massachusetts. And by the 1774, they're thinking, all right, we've got to be able to communicate and correspond. So they create what's called a committee of correspondence to write letters between patriot leaders. They also establish something called a Continental Congress, where men from all 13 colonies are going to be meeting in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and there they're going to be strategizing and debating what the next steps should be. And for those, we can move around to the other side of this display. We mentioned Patrick Henry being the voice of the revolution, but he didn't have great eyesight, so he required spectacles, as they would have called them at that time. And these are one of two pairs he owned, we believe. We know that this was one of the pair he owned. So I think that's a really neat artifact, because you can imagine it's a personal thing. It's something people put on their head every day, and it makes it really close to the history of the person you're talking about. Likewise, we talked about Jefferson being this famous author. He had written a document called The Rights of British North American that the man in red had read. The man in red is John Adams from Massachusetts, and he's going to be part of that Continental Congress committee that's assigned with the job of declaring our independence. And that's what we see in the painting here. It's Benjamin Franklin sitting there holding paper, Jefferson standing. There were two others in the committee, but this is the primary group in the painting, which was not done at the time. So this was done much later. And it shows the rough copies on the floor and Jefferson standing there sort of dictating. And for a lot of people, this was the breaking point. When we declared our independence and ratified it on July 4th, 1776, this became the birthday of a new nation, the United States of America. Now, we talked about the military component of this war. Of course, wars involve diplomacy, but really it's the fighting that's going to win or lose a war. And at the beginning of this war, most people thought the Americans had no chance. Britain was the most powerful nation in the world, had the world's largest navy, and these 13 colonies weren't even fully united yet. So George Washington had his work cut out for him. They didn't have a standing army. They would gather soldiers from every state in what are called militias, groups that represented the communities they came from. And this Continental Army is going to be the ones fighting with the British. Now, the fighting happens a lot outside of Virginia early in the war, but in 1775, there was a significant battle called the Battle of Great Bridge that happens in the eastern part of the state. So the fighting starts even before our independence was declared. After a famous battle called Lexington and Concord up in Massachusetts, Virginia is going to be really motivated to take further action. At that point, the war had begun. So talking about fighting, what kind of weapons are they using? Obviously, they don't have tanks and air forces like today. They had cavalry, men who rode on horseback called dragoons. They would get off their horses and fight and be able to move around quickly. And we have a helmet of a British soldier who was killed in Virginia, who was one of these dragoons. You can maybe see the image on the front of the little plate on the helmet shows a man on horseback. Above that, we see a musket. And if you can tell, the hammer that would strike the pan of gunpowder would be used to clamp a piece of flint or some rock that's going to make a spark to ignite the gunpowder. And these guns were not accurate like we think of rifles today. Later in our tours, we'll get to the Civil War and we'll see a change in that technology. But in the Revolution, men would mass up and fire in a general direction as a group. Now, individuals did sort of rise up and shine sometimes, and a Virginia example would be the story of Peter Francisco, who's considered literally a giant of the Revolution. Man was 16 years old and 6'5" and 260 some pounds, is why he filled out that enormous vest that we've got displayed there. It's not in our collections, but he also had a huge two-handed sword that he's said to have used in battle. One of those figures that's sort of larger than life to the point you don't know what really happened and what maybe got exaggerated after the war. Some people said during a retreat at one point he carried a cannon off the battlefield rather than let it fall into British hands. So a lot of stories that go with him. Now, like I said, a lot of the fighting happened, especially up in Massachusetts and New York. 1776 was not a great year for George Washington and the Continental Army. They lost the city of New York to a British invasion. And then they traveled down the East Coast. And Washington did turn out a really important victory on Christmas Eve in 1776, a surprise attack on the Germans. German mercenaries that were fighting for the British. They were called Hessians. There were also British in that army as well. The significance of that battle is it sort of raised morale. Morale means like the spirit of an army. And if an army's having lots of victories, their mood is up, they fight better. If they're losing, if they don't have enough food to eat, their morale gets lower, and that's an important part of the fighting as well. I'm going to point out the woman in this portrait because she was key to improving morale during a really terrible time for the Continental Army. They were bunkered down in really cold over the winter in a place called Valley Forge. And we actually have a letter here that was written by George Washington talking about how Martha is going to be bringing supplies to the army. She's going to organize and coordinate relief supplies and have those transferred to the Continental Army to keep the army fed, clothed, and to keep their morale up. Now, the war is going to continue through the 1770s into the early 1780s. And back in Britain, a lot of people there were kind of over it. Some of those people were saying, let's just stop fighting it. Some of the elected representatives in Parliament were what you call doves. They didn't want to keep fighting this war. And so people were looking at the politics of both sides. One thing to remember is that we were a country that had declared its independence, but that idea of freedom did not apply to everyone. Early in the war, Royal Governor Lord Dunmore evacuated and got out of the state because the Patriots were on the move. But he issued a proclamation. He said, any enslaved person who will come and serve the British Army can become free. We'll give you your freedom. And so when you think of the revolution and ideas of independence and liberty, that depended on who you were, what that would mean. We don't know exactly how many people were able to find freedom by serving the British. Somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 we think actually escaped. And Thomas Jefferson himself said that in Virginia, he thought the number was about 20 or 30,000 people escaped when the British invaded in a campaign called the Virginia Campaign. This will kind of bring us up to the image I want to show you right here. British General Lord Cornwallis had been fighting with his army down in South Carolina into North Carolina and brought them up the York River through the Chesapeake Bay and settled in a town called Yorktown. The idea was to winter there and get a base of supplies. And the Americans found out about this movement. George Washington and some of our French allies are going to move swiftly south so that they can try to basically trap the British in Yorktown. Now, in this image, you also see some ships in the area labeled the York River with that little arrow there. Some of the ships along the side of the city were sunk by the British on purpose to block an invasion. But some of those ships are French. And I didn't mention this earlier, but the French were the United States' greatest ally during this American Revolution. They supplied the vast majority of our gunpowder, along with uniforms, weapons, tents. And before Yorktown, they won a great naval battle called the Battle of the Chesapeake that blocked the British from being able to retreat by water. So when you're surrounded in a place by your enemy, that's called a siege. Yorktown siege ends in 1781 in November with Lord Cornwallis surrendering a little over 8,000 men, which was a very large army in this conflict. And so I don't know if we can peek this image over here, shows the surrender at Yorktown. I'll just kind of point it out. There was a funny little episode where Lord Cornwallis was so humiliated at his defeat that he refused to attend the ceremony. And so he tried to have his second in command offer his sword to a French officer, and the French officer said, no, give it to the Americans. And it kind of went back and forth. But ultimately, the surrender at Yorktown is going to lead to a permanent peace. That will be formalized a couple years later in Paris with something called the Treaty of Paris. The British, by 1783, have evacuated New York and are going back across the ocean. So America is now the United States of America, but not the one that we recognize today. For some years, we had a government called the Articles of the Confederation, and that had been established in 1776 along with the Declaration of Independence. I won't go deep into that, but the Articles of the Confederation were a government in which each of the 13 states was like its own little nation. There was no federal government the way we think of it today. The central government was not allowed to raise an army or tax the states. And this became a problem as we negotiated with other nations. We couldn't negotiate treaties that applied to all 13 states because each one was individual. So there was an idea that we needed a new government as a new nation. So by 1787, we are assembling in Philadelphia again for a constitutional convention. Patrick Henry had famously said, when he heard there was going to be a convention, I smell a rat. Because originally the idea was just to revise the Articles of the Confederation. But in reality, they wanted to create an entirely new government. So Patrick Henry is what we would call an anti-federalist. Federalists wanted a strong central government with more power than the states, and an anti-federalist thought power should reside with the states themselves. I don't know if this shows up very well, but this map shows a bit of Virginia, and by the darker red color, you can see where federalism was most popular and where people were more divided. Ultimately, Virginia did vote to ratify the US Constitution, but it only succeeded by about 10 votes in Virginia, so it was a close margin. And when we're talking about the Constitution, this Virginian is very important to acknowledge. This is James Madison. James Madison, some of the students in the audience probably know, he gets the nickname Father of the Constitution. He is probably the shortest president in history. I always kind of notice when I look at this portrait, he's a small guy, kind of like me. But he's a genius when it comes to politics. He and the man here, George Mason, had authored the Virginia Constitution. And when they come back around to make a US Constitution, they're thinking, all right, well, let's use some of those same ideas we used in Virginia. And one idea was to break the power of the government up into different parts, so that instead of having a king who made more decisions, they would have other bodies that would share that responsibility. So we've got George Washington here. All of you know that he's the first president, and throughout the 13 states, he was unanimously chosen to be that first president, and he was president for 4 years, is what a single term would be. He was reelected and served another 4 terms. Now, at that point, there was no rule saying that you couldn't keep running for president forever. But Washington did something nobody expected, especially other leaders throughout the world were surprised when he said, I'm going to step down and I'm going to let someone else become president. This idea of a peaceful transfer of power was revolutionary. People kind of expected that he would set himself up as a king and try to stay in power, but instead he went back to Mount Vernon and took up that life as opposed to his political life. So we use a term precedent, not president, but precedent, which means an example that gets set. And a lot of future presidents are going to look to the precedents that were set by George Washington when they're trying to think of, all right, what does this office mean? Now, I mentioned a few people here. John Marshall, Chief Justice John Marshall, is going to be the head judge of what becomes the American Supreme Court, or the U.S. Supreme Court. So this is a good point to look at our 3 branches as they're labeled on the wall. Branches of a tree reach out and are supported by the same body, though. And the 3 branches that get developed in the Constitution are the one we see here, the legislative branch, or what we would call Congress. And James Madison is going to serve in that body. The Congress is going to be consisting of 2 different groups of people, 2 bodies. One is the Senate. In the Senate, this is the higher body in Congress that gets the final say on legislation. Every state gets 2. It doesn't matter if you're a small state with less people like Rhode Island or a big state like New York with lots of people. Every state got 2 senators. The other body, the House of Representatives, was based on how many people lived in that state. This brought up a big question, which was slavery. In the South, you had a lot of people that are enslaved. Slavery had existed in the North, but states like Massachusetts began to abolish it as early as 1776. So if part of your political representation is based on how many people live in your state, a lot of Southern politicians said enslaved people should count towards our numbers. That logically didn't make sense to a lot of people but they're legally not citizens. They cannot vote. By your own laws, you consider them property. So one of the ugly facts of the Constitution is there was a compromise between slaveholding interest and the interests of northern states that said that enslaved people would count for 3/5 of their total number to go towards that apportionment of representation. This will be an issue that we'll look at more as we go forward. Just to explain real quick, Congress makes a law. The president signs a law. And if the president doesn't like a law, he can veto it. He can say no. Congress has a second chance where they can try to override that veto with enough votes. And if a law does get passed, it still has to be cleared by the Supreme Court if anyone says it violates our Constitution. So the U.S. Constitution, besides saying how government works, says what rights we have. And George Mason here had written a document called the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The idea was that certain rights exist by nature. So the first time we changed the Constitution, these are called amendments. And the First Amendment is going to say you have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to petition, to assemble, some of our most basic rights. So if Congress made a law saying that you didn't have a right to gather as a group, that would be challenged and could go up to the Supreme Court, and they would decide whether that was constitutional or not. Now, as we wrap up here, we've kind of gone through the Revolution and this new republic, but we also have this Western territory that nobody knows really what's out there besides the people living there. And when I say the people living there, never forget there are Native Americans that are not being affected by the politics of the East yet. As America moves west, a lot of these cultures are going to come into contact, conflict, and that's part of this story as well with Westward Movement. But a more peaceful example of what happened would be the expedition of Lewis and Clark and the Army Corps of Discovery, who are sent by President Thomas Jefferson in 1803 to explore what lies beyond the Mississippi River in North America. That land had been claimed by France, and their leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, was involved in wars in Europe and said, I don't have time to keep up with this land. If you guys want it, I'll let you have our claim for $15 million. Thus, the United States doubled in size. And at this point, people want to move out there. They want to see what's available there, especially after Virginia's fortunes begin to decline. At the end of the Revolution, Virginia is one of the most powerful states. 4 of the 5 first presidents came from Virginia. You've got George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. But then something happens to the soil, and it has to do with tobacco. Any student in Virginia knows tobacco was the cash crop that really made the economy go. And it is also really destructive to the soil. And what happens is when the nutrients from the ground get depleted or run out from growing tobacco, you're left with dead soil or played out soil. And that led to an out-migration. About 1 million people from Virginia moved away between the time of the Revolution and the 1860s. And so what I have behind me is one of the vehicles for that movement. This is called a Conestoga Wagon. And Conestoga is a river and a valley up in Pennsylvania that in the 1700s was occupied by a lot of German Americans. And some of those German Americans began moving south into the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And so they brought their culture with them. There were also a group called the Scott Irish that had heavy populations in the Shenandoah Valley. And these cultures were kind of different from the more English culture of the East. Now, this vehicle is about 200 years old, minus the rope and canvas, which would be called a bonnet. But the wood and metal are original. You can still see almost a little bit of the red paint for the undercarriage, and the sides would have been blue. And this was a good vehicle for the East Coast, especially in the Piedmont or hilly regions, because it was designed to keep cargo settled. That curved middle would allow things to shift into the center when you went up and down hills, as opposed to sliding to the front or the back, able to carry close to 3 tons. Most of the time, the wheels were rimmed with metal to help protect them. But in a way, this vehicle becomes sort of like the U-Haul truck for this migration of people moving westward. And as we kind of continue with the story of Virginia, we're going to see what happens in the state as more people leave and the people who remain, what's going to become of their lives. So we will pick that up again next time. We'll begin kind of with this westward movement and go into the Civil War. So thank you all for attending today. And I'll go ahead and stop there. And again, feel free to check our website, virginiahistory.org, for lots of other content that we're putting up all the time.
And if anybody has any questions and would like to submit them in the comments, you can do so, and we will have to answer those. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. We will give you a minute just to send in your last thought. If it doesn't look like we have too many questions coming in, so I think that we are good to go. Again, everybody, just check our website, virginiahistory.org, for more information, and we'll see you later.
Bye, everyone.